Born in Ohio in 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer had a troubled childhood. His parents divorced when he was young, and he struggled with alcoholism and depression. He was also known for his fascination with animals and for collecting roadkill. At the age of 18, Dahmer committed his first murder. Over the course of the next 13 years, he would go on to murder 17 more people. Most of his victims were young men that he lured back to his home with promises of money or drugs. Once inside, Dahmer would drug and strangle his victims before dismembering and sometimes cannibalizing them. He also kept some of the body parts as souvenirs. In 1991, Dahmer was finally arrested after one of his victims escaped and alerted the police. He was convicted on 15 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. In 1994, Dahmer was killed in prison by a fellow inmate. His case remains one of the most notorious serial killer cases in modern history. The Jeffrey Dahmer case is one of the most disturbing in the history of criminology. We may never fully understand what led Dahmer to commit such acts of depravity, but one thing is certain: he was a true monster. Join us as we delve into the twisted mind of one of America's most notorious killers. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. The son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His mother Joyce worked as a chemist, and his father Lionel taught teletype machines. Although being born into what appeared to be a solid household, Dahmer experienced neglect, emotional instability, and divorce during his formative years. While there are different accounts of whether Dahmer was mistreated or spoiled as a child, it is obvious that he came from a dysfunctional family. Despite these difficulties, Dahmer was initially a shy and reserved kid. Yet he had double hernia surgery when he was just 3 years old, which might have influenced his later interest in human anatomy. When Dahmer was about 6 years old and his younger brother David was born, the family relocated to Ohio. Dahmer developed a fascination with dead animals from a young age. When he witnessed his father remove animal bones from under their house, he became captivated with them. He began gathering bug remains and the bones of tiny animals like squirrels, preserving them in formaldehyde jars. Dahmer started gathering roadkill so he could dissect it and add more bones to his collection after his father taught him how to bleach and preserve animal bones. Dahmer was a misfit in high school. He was a heavy drinker who described alcohol to his friends as his medication. His grades were mediocre, despite the fact that his teachers thought he had strong academic potential. He had been calm before, but now he started acting out tantrums and making fun of those with cerebral palsy. Although Dahmer had a brief relationship with another young boy in his early teens, he kept his sexual orientation a secret from his parents. Eventually, he said that he has fantasies about controlling a male partner who is subservient, and these fantasies started to entail dissection. The entire scope of Dahmer's depravity wouldn't be known until years after his horrible atrocities, but his early experiences and obsession with human anatomy would eventually contribute to them. Dahmer was regarded as an outsider starting in his freshman year at Revere High School, RHS. He started consuming beer and hard liquor during the day at the age of 14, usually hiding his alcohol in the jacket he wore to school. Dahmer said to one pupil who queried why he was drinking scotch in the morning history lecture that the booze he ingested was my medicine. Staff members in his first year said Dahmer was courteous and extremely intelligent, but had ordinary grades despite being largely mute. He played tennis competitively, and for a short time, in the high school band. Dahmer didn't tell his parents when he came out as gay throughout puberty. He briefly dated another teenage male in his early teens, but they never had sexual relations. When he was in his early to mid-teens, according to Dahmer's future admission, he started fantasizing about dominating a completely obedient male partner. With time, his thoughts about masturbation changed to center on chests and torsos. Dissection progressively merged with these fancies. When he was around 16, Dahmer had a fantasy about knocking out a particular gorgeous guy jogger so that he might use his body for sex. On one occasion, Dahmer hid himself in bushes and waited for this man while holding a baseball bat. On that particular day, the jogger did not pass by, though. Later, Dahmer said that this was his first effort to attack and subdue a victim. Dahmer's grades had dropped by 1977. His parents had mixed results with the private tutor they hired. His parents went to counseling that same year in an effort to patch up their marriage. They kept fighting and fighting. In September of 1977, after Lionel learned that Joyce had a brief affair, they made the decision to end their marriage, assuring their sons that they hoped to do so amicably. Early in 1978, Lionel left home and briefly stayed in a motel on North Cleveland-Massillon Road, as their divorce proceedings quickly turned ugly and contentious. High school for Dahmer ended in May 1978. One of his professors saw Dahmer consuming multiple beer cans while sitting outside the school parking lot a few weeks before he graduated. Dahmer told the teacher he was having a lot of problems at home, and that the guidance counselor at the school was aware of them when the teacher threatened to report the situation. In defiance of a court order and without informing Lionel, Joyce left the family home that spring and moved in with David's relatives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Dahmer, who had recently turned 18, continued to live with his family. On July 24, 1978, the divorce between Dahmer's parents became official. The custody of Joyce's younger son and alimony payments were granted. Jeffrey Dahmer's first murder occurred in 1978, not long after he received his high school diploma, and it served as a catalyst for a horrific killing spree that would shock the entire world. Stephen Mark Hicks, 18, was picked up by Dahmer on a fateful day in June, and he promised him a laid-back evening of having a few drinks. Hicks had just entered the home of a sadistic and twisted murderer, but he was unaware of this. Hicks was persuaded to Dahmer's home, where he beat him to death with a dumbbell. After that, the violence continued as Dahmer strangled Hicks to make sure he was dead. After completing this horrifying act, Dahmer pulled off Hicks' clothes, masturbated over his lifeless body, and then began dissecting it. Dahmer dismembered the body with unsettling accuracy, then buried the fragments in a little hole in his backyard. He eventually dug up the bones so he could dissolve them in acid, but his fixation with his victim was far from done. In an effort to hide any traces of his heinous murder, Dahmer went even further and crushed and dispersed the bones. Jeffrey Dahmer's life spiraled out of control after committing his first murder. He soon joined the U.S. Army in an effort to restart his life. But during his tenure in the military, he continued to abuse alcohol and drink heavily. After receiving his release in 1981, Dahmer went back to his native Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Midway through the 1980s, Dahmer's depravity started to worsen. He began to frequent gay bathhouses where, in a blur of violence and wickedness, he would drug individuals before assaulting them. He often lured men back to his flat, where he would commit acts of sexual violence, demonstrating that his depraved impulses were not confined to these open spaces. Late in the 1980s, Dahmer carried out his second homicide. He met a man in a pub, persuaded him to return to a hotel room, then strangled and dismembered the victim. He then started his terrible acts of violence in his grandmother's house, which was where he was living at the time. As Dahmer experimented with various forms of torture and murder, his atrocities grew more savage and gory. He turned his grandmother's home into a macabre death lab, where he would entice young men and subject them to unspeakable torture. His fixation with mutilation and necrophilia knew no limitations, and he carried out a number of terrible activities on the dead bodies of his victims. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer's insatiable need for violence and perversion peaked. His grandmother had been wary of his actions for a while, and eventually she asked him to leave her house. The causes were obvious. He was binge drinking, he would bring young men home at all hours of the night, and the filthy odors coming from the garage and basement were getting intolerable. She had no idea that her grandson was keeping his victims there and disposing of them there. While living in Milwaukee, Dahmer continued his deadly rampage. He would entice young men back to his flat, drug them, rape them, torture them horribly, and then kill them. His later crimes frequently entailed cannibalism, necrophilia, and skeleton preservation. The depths of Dahmer's wickedness were unfathomable. He would store various body parts in his refrigerator, such as heads that he frequently used for intercourse. He also attempted to induce a zombie-like state in his victims by drilling holes in their heads and injecting acid into them. He frequently killed his victims in his depraved experiments, dismembered their bodies, and disposed of them in a variety of horrifying ways. Although Jeffrey Dahmer had a long history of legal troubles, it wasn't until 1991 that the full scope of his horrifying acts came to light. Authorities had often detained him over the years, including for groping a young boy, but they had never been able to link him to any of the disappearances that had plagued the Milwaukee region. Dahmer wasn't apprehended by the police until one of his planned victims managed to flee. Tracy Edwards was picked up by Dahmer and brought back to his apartment in the summer of 1991. He was brutally tortured and raped there before he was able to flee by sprinting down the street while sporting a pair of handcuffs hanging from his wrist. The horrible crimes committed by Dahmer were discovered thanks to Edwards' escape. Police discovered decapitated heads and body parts in his fridge, freezer, filing cabinet, and even kettle when they searched his flat. Even the most experienced officers were horrified by the scene because it was so horrific. Finally, Dahmer's reign of terror came to an end. He was detained and faced 15 murder charges. As a result, his trial was one of the most publicized in American history. His atrocities' graphic details horrified the world and solidified his reputation as one of history's most heinous and terrible serial killers. Jeffrey Dahmer was finally brought to trial in 1992 and given a life sentence. The jury did not change its mind despite efforts to persuade them that his cannibalism and necrophilia were caused by mental disease. Dahmer was judged to be entirely responsible for his deeds, despite having been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic condition. Some of the most horrifying evidence ever seen in a U.S. courtroom was given to the jury during his trial. The horrific specifics of Dahmer's murders included cannibalism, necrophilia, and the long-term storage of his victims' body parts. Even the most seasoned attorneys were almost unable to handle the extent of his wickedness. Dahmer never attempted to avoid accountability for his horrifying deeds. He acknowledged in his statement to the court that he was aware of his illness and that he deserved to be punished for his acts. He also expressed his desire to pass away, saying that he had never desired freedom and that he had come to terms with his predicament. 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole were imposed on Dahmer. He would serve out the remainder of his days in prison as retribution for the horrible crimes he had done. His situation continues to rank among the most horrifying and sickening instances of human depravity in recent memory. Christopher Scarver, a fellow prisoner at the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage, Wisconsin, beat Jeffrey Dahmer to death on November 28, 1994. Scarver finally revealed why he killed Dahmer more than 20 years after the incident. Scarver stated that after becoming alarmed by the murderer, who he claimed would manufacture severed limbs out of prison food and drizzle them with packets of ketchup as blood, he fatally whacked Dahmer twice over the head with a metal club. According to Scarver, he would plant them in areas where people would be. The New York Post. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the horrific crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. Despite being diagnosed with several mental disorders, Dahmer was found fully responsible for the gruesome murders, cannibalism, and necrophilia that he committed over the course of more than a decade. His trial was one of the most high-profile in American history, and the details of his crimes shocked the world. Even today, the extent of his depravity remains almost unimaginable. While we may never fully understand what drove Dahmer to commit such heinous acts, we can take some small comfort in the fact that he was brought to justice and will never again be able to harm anyone. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more true crime content. And as always, stay safe out there.